Good evening for those of you joining us from Western Canada. Good morning, Dao Hao, for those of us joining from the other side of the Pacific. My name is Carlo Dade. I am the director of the Center for Trade and Investment at the Canada West Foundation here in Calgary. It's my privilege and honor to welcome you to the first of what will be a series of what we hope are a new type of trade talk to inform Western Canadian businesses and policymakers about changes in the global trade landscape in the year ahead. My role as moderator today is to quickly walk you through what we're doing and how we're going to do it, then to introduce the speaker and our panelist. As I mentioned, this is a new type of event, so that brief introduction hopefully is necessary. As with so many other things that have impacted us so far in 2021, it's been a reaction to the events of last year, not just being here on Zoom, but on the trade front. It really seemed to be a year of one nasty surprise after another, seemingly coming out of the blue and seemingly coming without pause. While we can't do anything about COVID, we did think that we could do something about these nasty surprises, calling in global experts from some of the key regions with which we trade to give us insights. Things that are surprises for us may be less of a surprise for folks who are on the ground abroad and deeply and intimately involved with the day-to-day management of trade in that region. So what we'll do, if you can imagine this being akin to attending a global trade event back when we could all travel and hearing one of the most stunning keynotes you've heard that impacts your business. Then, after the keynote, walking into the coffee shop, or as someone pointed out, given this group, stumbling into the bar and seeing the keynote speaker sitting at a table with four people whom you know from the trade infrastructure apparatus in Western Canada having a conversation, and you have the ability to pull up a chair. That's what we're trying to do with the series, and that's what we're trying to do tonight. So pull up a chair and join us in welcoming a person. I can't think of a better person with whom to start this idea. Someone who, for three factors, is probably the best person to start the series and to talk to us about what's happening in Asia. Dr. Deb Elms is the founder and CEO of the Asian Trade Center. She joins us from Singapore. Deb first is an expert's expert on Asian trade, trade agreements, and supply chains in the region. She's someone whom I and other trade experts call upon for help and insights. Second, her expertise is not just on the agreements, but on practical issues, supply and production chains, and really on how small and medium enterprises can use these agreements. She writes practical case studies and guides and has a consultancy to advise small businesses. Third, Deb's done extensive work with us at the Canada West Foundation. You'll see her name in our research. You'll see us quoting her, using her research, even publishing op-eds with her in the Globe and Mail. So she certainly knows Canada West well. So join me in thanking EDC, Export Development Canada, who's supporting the series, and join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Elms, who's coming to us this morning from Singapore.
Thank you so much. That was such a sweet introduction. I'm a little nervous now because what if I'm not the greatest keynote you've ever heard and you don't want to talk to me at the bar afterwards? It would be kind of intimidating to sit on the bar stool by myself. So thank you so much for that. I'm delighted to work with Canada West again on this project to talk about trade. I think the format is quite interesting. Hopefully it takes off because I do like the idea. So I'll try to be brief in giving you a little bit of an outlook for trade in Asia and then how that relates to Canada. And I'm, again, more than happy to take questions from people. So let me start by saying that we are extremely busy with trade in Asia. I sit in Singapore, have been here since 2005. We in Asia are still enthusiastic practitioners of trade agreements, especially. And you see that at every level with even under COVID, the closure of various kinds of trade deals, bilateral, regional, et cetera, the expansion of other trade agreements. One that we're looking forward to in particular is the expansion of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which also includes Canada. That will get underway this year. I would assume it gets underway this year. For sure, in line to join is the United Kingdom, the UK. Now that they've Brexited from the European Union, they want to join the CPTPP. There are other countries that are likely to be trying to join that agreement as well, including South Korea. Taiwan is extraordinarily interested in joining CPTPP. Politically, it's difficult, but we'll see. Even China has expressed from the highest levels interest in looking into joining the CPTPP. I don't think you should expect China in anytime soon, but I don't think you should dismiss the idea that China wants to get into this agreement. And then, what that looks like for countries that have to be in the TPP negotiating with China. This will get very interesting very quickly. So we will see the expansion of the CPTPP, and I'm, again, more than happy to discuss that in more detail. We also have a number of digital agreements that are going on in this region, and I just want to mention one briefly, which is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA. It currently contains Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, and Canada is apparently about to join DEPA, which I think is great. It shows Canada's continued enthusiasm for trade agreements, for integration with the Pacific, broadly speaking, since it's also, this particular one also includes Chile. I think that's quite interesting and quite useful. For an export-oriented part of the country, as you all are sitting in Western Canada, I think that anything you can do to be more firmly anchored in Asia or in the Pacific, I think is useful. So those are two things that directly involve Canada. Then let me spend most of my time in my brief remarks at the beginning talking about something that doesn't directly involve Canada, but is indirectly important to you, which is the closure and the soon to come into force launch of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So this is an agreement that may have caught people by surprise because it was signed in November and is moving towards entry into force. I would expect that by this time next year, it could be slightly earlier, but basically by this time next year, RCEP will be in force. It includes 15 countries, all 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and ASEAN, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So 15 countries, basically all of Asia, coming together for the first time in one integrated agreement. RCEP is not yet the CPTPP. So those of you who are familiar with the quality and the depth and the breadth of CPTPP commitments may be slightly disappointed in RCEP, because I would say, so CPTPP is sort of here, RCEP is sort of here. It's got some fantastic things for businesses that you need to pay attention to, but the overall depth and breadth is not the same. And you can see that in things like tariff concessions. So CPTPP basically cuts tariffs to zero on everything except cream cheese into Japan. Everything else is zero, or will be zero, or is almost zero. Because remember, we're in year 4 now of tariff concessions on CPTPP. So you're basically at zero tariffs around the region that are in CPTPP. RCEP, by contrast, does not cut all tariffs. It does not cut all tariffs to zero. And some of the timelines are quite long, currently set to as long as 20 years. And I know businesses in the room are now crying because, a 20-year time horizon is not helpful for businesses. But you should expect that many of those cut right away. So it's not all doom and gloom. And many of those will likely be brought forward so the timeline will shrink. Some of the members are very cautious in their negotiation. And so they were nervous about allowing these 15 countries, many of whom are export powerhouses in their own right, the ability to have more competition domestically. So they put very long timelines in. So RCEP is comprehensive like TPP, about 510 pages of legally binding text, most of it legally binding text, 14,000 pages of schedules, individual country schedules, tariffs, services, investment provisions. It includes other things like intellectual property rights, actually quite a good chapter, very similar in many ways to the CPTPP chapter, partly driven by the members who were in both. We have 7 countries that did CPTPP and in RCEP, and they tried to pull across some of those ideas. So we have services, investment, intellectual property rights. There's a wretched e-commerce chapter in RCEP. a little bit on standards. And the net result of this whole thing is that we have started to create a platform now in Asia for Asia. So you will start to create supply chains, particularly that are designed for producing goods and delivering services in Asia for Asia. Now, you may say, well, Asia already does an awful lot of trade and they do an awful lot of exporting. What's the difference? The difference, I think, is that we have, of course, we have a lot of things move around Asia, but it tends to be raw materials and parts and components, which are then brought to different places in Asia, assembled, and then exported to final markets, especially the Europeans and the Americans, because they tend to be lucrative final markets and they're very big. So we tend to produce things here and then export them out. What we don't do in Asia necessarily is produce things in Asia that stay in Asia. So the final product ends up in Asia. And the reason for that, there's many reasons for that, but one of them is it's surprisingly difficult, or it has been surprisingly difficult to trade in the region. And so we find firms that are structurally set up to trade not in this region, or to trade only parts and components, like narrow slices of trade, rather than the whole integrated supply chain. I think what RCEP does is it sets us up for easier trade and easier movement in Asia for Asia. It also, and I think this is where we are finding more and more interest, or more and more concern from outside parties, once you set up a supply chain in Asia for Asia, it is harder for non-Asian inputs to be part of that supply chain. Doesn't mean it's impossible. And in fact, many of the rules of origin in RCEP that you need to do in order to qualify for lower tariffs allow often up to 60% foreign inputs, foreign parts, foreign components, foreign raw materials. It's going to become easier for firms to just say, never mind the foreign stuff. Let me try to find sourcing in and around 15 markets in Asia, because then I don't even have to worry about qualifying for RCEP benefits. I get them sort of because I've already cleared the hurdle, and I can now use whatever I'm producing in Asia and send it to 15 markets, many of whom are large, lucrative, and growing. So I think we have some competitiveness concerns that is rattling foreign producers, especially. And I think that's why there's so much interest in RCEP. One of the reasons why there's so much interest in RCEP. So, I'm happy to talk to you guys this morning, or my morning. Yesterday for me, it was the Germans. So yesterday was German Parliament, who was deeply interested in what's going on in this agreement and what does it do for supply chains in Asia. Crucially for them, what does it do for automotive supply chains, et cetera. So you see this sort of concern around this. And then the last thing, and then I'll stop and take questions from all of you. The last thing that, of course, is of worry, or at least of interest, depending on your perspective, the ability now of Asia to create a platform for the discussion of trade and economic issues in Asia. Now, we have not had that before. And I will tell you that that was not the original intention of RCEP. When they started RCEP back in 2012, the original idea was we had 5 existing agreements between ASEAN and what it calls its dialogue partners. So ASEAN Japan, ASEAN Korea, ASEAN China, ASEAN India, and then ASEAN Australia, New Zealand. So 5 of these agreements. For companies, 5 agreements is unhelpful, because you had to try to understand 5 agreements, you had 5 certificates of origin, 5 different sets of rules. So they said, this is complicated. Let's just put them all on the table, bundle them up, RCEP. This is going to be fast, it's going to be easy, 3 years will be done. Turns out it's harder to do than they thought, because although ASEAN had agreements with all 5, the dialogue partners did not. And crucially, Japan had no agreement with Korea. Japan had no agreement with China. Almost no one had an agreement with India, and especially the India-China relationship was really difficult. And so the net result of that is it took us 8 years to get RCEP done. But what I think is interesting about RCEP is that now that it's finished, we have an institutional structure in Asia, not just in ASEAN, but in Asia, for discussing trade and economic issues. So RCEP will have a secretariat, which the CPTPP still does not, to my great dismay. So RCEP will have a secretariat, and RCEP will work like ASEAN does, which is to say, we're going to have officials meetings, they will have ministers meetings, and then they will have a leaders summit every year in RCEP. And once you start that sort of institutional train, especially those of you in government will know, you don't go to your minister without having something for your minister to announce, because your minister isn't interested in just showing up to show up. Your minister wants a deliverable. So the minister then has to have a deliverable, which has to be given then to the leaders. And so once you start that institutional process, you're going to start to see RCEP, I think, create new rules, new standards, new provisions. It will get broader, it will get deeper over time as this sort of, institutional train leaves the station and they start adding things onto the RCEP calendar. So I think that's what makes RCEP particularly interesting. You should view it now as the base that will be expanded and improved upon over time. So for those companies who are saying, well, some of what I want is in, some of what I want is not in, don't all hope is not lost, because there will be new opportunities to improve this agreement over time. And I think that's an important part of this deal, but also part of why RCEP makes people nervous. Let me stop there. I think that's sort of long enough as an introduction, and I'm happy to take questions on anything and everything.
Well, thanks, Deb. As always, a great overview, and no worry about being at the bar by yourself after that sort of opening remarks. Quickly, could you run through the 15 members of RCEP? Put you on the spot here. It's pretty much everyone in Asia except India?
Taiwan and India. So
Except
Taiwan is
and
out
India.
because Taiwan is out of everything because of political issues, which is unfortunate for Taiwan, but what can you do? And India is now out because they were in. So India was in from the very first round through at least 20, we lost count, but I think there was 29 rounds of RCEP before we had substantial conclusion in November of 2019. So November 2019 happens. The leaders all get together in Bangkok for the big jamboree announcement. It was exciting. We will have the conclusion, substantial conclusion, because they had a few more details, which they expected they would have wrapped up by February last year. And all 16 leaders, so all 10 members of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India, all got up on stage. They all did the sort of ASEAN handshake, this picture you get, including Prime Minister Modi from India, who then, after he shook hands with everyone, got up and gave this sort of fiery speech on the ground in Bangkok in Hindi, no translation, so no one knew what he said. And it turns out what he was saying was, there is no way in hell that we will join this agreement. There is nothing in here that India wants. We're not going to do it. And everyone they didn't know. So they had polite applause. Yeah, this is fantastic. And then afterwards, everyone, what? What do you mean they're not coming in? So they dropped out on the sort of conclusion, substantial conclusion. And so what took so long for RCEP, it took a full year, was how can we get India back? And crucially, like Japan especially was yanking on India, trying to get them back in, because Japan does not want to try to face China one-on-one as RCEP goes forward. This is like more complicated. So if we could have India in, it would be easier. But India was no, they didn't even show up. Not only did they were not interested. They said they were not interested. ASEAN held special meetings. The Indians didn't show. Japan held meetings. The Indians didn't show. So finally they had to admit, okay, they're not coming back. Let's figure out now, what are we going to do with India not in? So it took a couple of months of sorting out how are we going to handle this. So RCEP decided to put all of India's schedules to the side. India can come in at any time when they choose to do so. There is an accession clause where RCEP will be open for new members. It will start 18 months after the agreement comes into force. India could come earlier if they chose to. I think there's no way they're going to, but whatever, they have that option. And then 18 months from the entry into force, we will have accession open for accession. Who will be part of that, I think, is a little unclear at the moment, because it's a ways away, and we need to see how RCEP works. But RCEP will go into force, because I think I forgot to say this. We need 6 out of 10 members of ASEAN and 3 out of the 5 dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, to say yes. And 60 days after that, we have RCEP. Given how quick the ratification procedure is in ASEAN members, that could be that's not an issue in terms of they just have to decide they're ready and then they're in. The dialogue partner is a little more complicated, and the Australians are the worst because the Australians have a super complicated approval process. So they could be slow just because their procedures are slow. But the goal of this is to get done this year, 2021, so that it launches either at the end of 2021 or early into 2022 without the Indians. And then 18 months later, we can open for accession for new members.
Wow, that's two critical points for Canada there. One, the Aussies and the Kiwis are in and we're not. And two, for those thinking about an easy trade negotiation, why don't we just go negotiate a trade agreement with India? I think you brought a lot of people up short. So let me bring in our colleagues and partners from the prairies. Joining us, and we'll go right to left, depending on how you're looking at the map. Joining us from the World Trade Center in Winnipeg is the president and CEO, Mariette Mulaire. Joining us from Saskatchewan, I believe, Chris Dekker, president and CEO of Saskatchewan Trade Export Partnership. And joining us from just up the road in Edmonton, Mustafa Sahin, vice president for investment and trade at Edmonton Global. And I should note, next week we'll be joined by Calgary Economic Development. So we drew straws, and Chris Dekker made the mistake of asking how we were going to decide who goes first. So that means the honor falls to our friends from next door in Saskatchewan. Chris.
Well, thank you, Carlo, and thank you to you and your staff at the Canada West Foundation for putting this opportunity together. Thank you to our sponsors in EDC, and a quick shout out to my colleagues and friends in both Winnipeg and Edmonton. Great to be on a panel with you, albeit via the interweb. Deb, what a great presentation. Thank you for that. Both insightful and valuable, particularly as Carlo noted at the beginning, it's practical and it's a pragmatic approach, and it has an SME focus, which is particularly helpful for us. I wanted to get the first question in a sort of a follow-up on your observations as it relates to TPP, which is an important market for us. 11 markets, nearly half a billion people, $10 trillion US in market opportunity for us. You talked about potential new partners to TPP. One of the, I guess, unintended benefits to the remaining partners was the departure of the US from the agreement, in that we had preferred access to these markets, and yet still had our preferred access to the US through the new NAFTA. Now, we know that the new administration, Biden administration, will be domestically focused, certainly within the short term. But what do you think the chances are of the US rejoining the TPP, and what will be the impacts to the remaining partners?
Great question. There is growing pressure, as you might imagine, in Washington to rejoin the CPTPP. And there's pressure for a lot of reasons: commercial pressure from different kinds of companies in different locations, et cetera, but also political pressure because the US is not very well engaged in Asia on the economic front. The US only has trade agreements with the Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and the Singaporeans, so only 4. That is problematic compared to their major competitors, including Canada, which is actually much more integrated in the region economically than the US is at this point, and the Europeans. The Europeans are extremely active and becoming more enthusiastically active around joining Asian agreements and figuring out Asian linkages. So the US has its work cut out for it in figuring out how do they return to Asia, how do they engage better with Asia. The obvious solution to that for many is we should just rejoin the CPTPP, because that's the fastest, easiest way for us to get access to markets in the region. It's the agreement that we negotiated, so we're comfortable with that. We know what the rules are, et cetera. The problem for the US, well, there are many, but one is, this became a very toxic agreement over the last few years. And so for the US to say that it wants to come back to the TPP, CPTPP is politically difficult in the US because they've spent the last few years saying this is a wretched agreement and the US should have nothing to do with it. So that right there makes it difficult. Second, it's difficult because of a practical problem in the US, which is the US, and I'm sure many of you in Canada alarmingly familiar actually with US trade policy rules. You have to have in place Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, in order to negotiate a trade agreement. So Congress says to the White House, we give you authorization to negotiate on our behalf. You go out, here's what we want, basically broadly, you go out, you negotiate, you come back to us with a deal that looks roughly like we told you to, and we promise that we will not unravel it. We will either say yes or we will say no, but we will not go through and unpick it. So Trade Promotion Authority, absolutely critical. The problem for the US now, or another problem for the US now, is that that expires on July 1st of this year. That is always a really unpleasant conversation on Capitol Hill. What are we going to do on trade policy, and are we going to give approval for Trade Promotion Authority? You have to have it. You can't do the CPTPP really. I mean, you could, if I was a lawyer, I could come up with some creative way to say I don't actually need it, but it would be tricky. So I think you have to have TPA in place. Getting it in place is actually going to be very hard. It's always hard. It's particularly hard now, I think, because we have completely scrambled views on trade in the two major parties. Traditionally, the Republicans, very enthusiastic about trade and economic integration, free trade, et cetera. Under Trump, they went in a different direction. So how much of the Republican Party is anti-trade, protectionist? How much of the Republican Party is traditional, free trade, et cetera? Unclear. And on the Democratic side, Democrats have traditionally been hostile to trade because they're worried about especially labor and the environment. How strong is that compared to their base, which has become very in favor of trade under especially the pandemic and trade war? So we have like scrambled coalitions between the two parties, and you have to try to tackle that at the same time that you're dealing with, and this is the problem for Biden, domestic issues. He does not want to focus on foreign issues. He wants to focus on building back better, solving the pandemic, dealing with infrastructure, upgrading education, all these kinds of domestic issues. A fight over trade derails that objective. So for the US to come back to TPP would require Trade Promotion Authority to be extended or approved or reapproved or reauthorized, all of which is complicated. Then they would have to get approval to come back to the TPP. And the negotiating conditions for TPP as they currently stand are unhelpful for the US because officially under TPP, CPTPP, you don't get to touch the text. The text is that the Bible is not changing. You're negotiating only your conditions of your own access, which the US already has. So they would presumably just turn all that back on again, tariff concessions, services schedules, et cetera. That is not helpful for the US. They're going to come in, they're going to say, no, we are not taking the text as it is. We want the following 800 changes to be made. And then the current members would have to say, well, are we willing to do that? And if we start to open that text, do we unravel the whole thing quickly? So, for the members, they want the US in. I think that's clear. It would be better. The agreement is better if it's bigger. No question. It's better if you have big players in, no question. But practically getting there is hard. And you have real challenges around what the US is going to ask if they come back or when they come back. So all of that makes it hard for the US, or harder than people imagine, I think, for the US to just say, yes, we would love to come back.
Oh, I'm listening to you, Deborah, and it's amazing. You're just a wealth of information. And actually, Chris Dekker owes me a coffee or beer or wine because he stole my question. I'm very curious about exactly this change in administration. So your answer was great. So I guess maybe I'll ask a question that's bringing us a little bit down more home. I'm in Manitoba. And lately we were able to attract a big French company called Mariette. It's a pea processing. And one of the reasons they picked Manitoba is not to be closer to the consumers, but closer to the producers. So the pea producers in Manitoba, kind of a change between, the security of supply as opposed to the security of demand. And so we're always interested, of course, in investment attraction. And with all these different trade agreements, trade can lead to investment. Is there something that Manitoba can do to attract Asian investors? Is there something that you can see that we could offer? Now, we know we're landlocked, like we realize where we are, but do you see some of the potential around maybe protein, maybe agriculture, other things that we can offer for Asian investment.
Yes, yeah, certainly.
Good.
I mean, we have so there's obviously just straight up investment promotion, which I think is important. And much of that, of course, is moving online, which is in some ways, I would think, more helpful, because now you don't have to physically attend investment conferences. You don't have to physically drag people out to the middle of Canada to tell them what you have to offer. You can do it on Zoom. And so I think in some ways, investment promotion is easier now, except that it's also more competitive because everyone can do that. So I think, just highlighting, as you've always done, and I think one of the things that Canada, it continues to dazzle me on, is its ability to have a sort of joined up approach to especially investment promotion, but in general on trade and economic issues. It's not just groups like you all, but you guys work very closely with your government, and then your government works incredibly closely with your embassies, and then your embassies have these sort of amazing commercial outreach to the markets in which they are placed, so that whole sort of joined up approach is unusual, and I think is a real advantage for Canada. So straight up investment promotion, I think you do have something to say, you have a story to tell. I think it's being told, you can continue to tell the story. This is a place that is increasingly worried about supply as well, especially food supply, which is where you started. That concerns over what happens with food stocks and food inventory and so forth is rising. The concern about that in Asia is rising. But also then I would leverage on these trade agreements themselves, and because they provide, again, additional incentives for investors. They're looking for new homes. They're looking for new destinations. So I would say CPTPP, of course. I mean, partly because, of course, I think it's a great agreement, but I think it's nice because it reminds people of, what the benefits are. So talking to the current members, talking to members that might be members, so like the Koreans through CPTPP, you could start having conversations with Korean investors over that. You can potentially leverage this for even Chinese investors. So you can say to the Chinese, hey, actually, your leadership has said that they want to come in, and let's start talking now about what that would look like and, what benefits you would get. So, I mean, I think anytime you can leverage an agreement like the CPTPP, it makes sense to me to do so. In ASEAN, and I know there's a huge enthusiasm for a Canada-ASEAN FTA, which I think is delusional still. But if you go down and you start looking at individual markets in ASEAN, you can do that. You can talk about the potential for an FTA with Indonesia and so forth, and go for it, I guess. But I would say better still for me is to go with the 4 CPTPP members, 2 of which have ratified the agreement and it's in force for Singapore, Vietnam. 2 of which have not ratified the agreement, but I would start pushing hard on the Malaysians to ratify. What is taking you so long? Get it done. And Brunei. I mean, Brunei is not going to be a huge market for you, but still, it's there. So that's 4 out of 6 ASEANs right there. That I think makes it easier. And then you point out why Canada is an attractive market to them. And I think you have some leverage that you may not have had in the past.
Right. So specifically on plant protein as being, we can see the world going towards that. Do you see something specific for plant protein for the Asian market in general? Because I know they'll develop their own. And
yes. I think if you want to discuss, I mean, the good news, we have lots of people who are vegetarian, vegan, et cetera, who are increasingly concerned about meat consumption. So you can, of course, highlight that. You can highlight the markets in this region like inbound investment as well. So they like to see that you can provide skills, training capacity about products, about processes, et cetera. So that's another thing to think about. So the investment doesn't all have to come one way. You can also work with building up markets and understanding, et cetera, in Asia, in key markets in Asia. So I think that's interesting, an interesting approach.
Just a quick note, on the TPP, it's not just the movement of goods, it's the movement of people. So you have special provisions to get business investors, to get technicians, to get business people in that the Americans don't. So we often think about the agreements only as moving goods, but we've got huge advantages under the agreement, especially compared to how the Americans treat folks trying to make it into the States. All right, so that takes us to Edmonton.
Deborah, thank you very much. You've provided a great canvas, and I'm going to indulge your artistic senses here, because I think when we're talking about trade and investment at this level, it's as much art as it is science, and your background is very artistic. Here's the canvas that I look at, right? So Canada is the only G7 country in the world currently that has trade agreements with all the other G7 countries. Because of CETA, the European Trade Agreement, because of the new USMCA, we'll call it, and because of CPTPP, we're in a unique position, and there's a window of opportunity because, as you mentioned, the US entering CPTPP is not a simple process. Combine that with global issues for Asia, like food security, which we just touched on with Mariette's question. Things like green energy, low carbon energy, growing demand, especially in Asia, markets like Japan, South Korea, China, and combining that with the infrastructure of trade that is logistics and supply chain, something which I know is near and dear to the hearts of Singapore and best in class, world class. Alberta and the prairies have tremendous capacity for plant proteins and the value chain of food chain. When we look at the emergence of hydrogen, and we've recently established a hydrogen hub here in the Edmonton region that is going to be one of Canada's focal points for a low carbon, green energy narrative. With that as the canvas, and keeping in mind that we want to have balanced trade and investment relationships, not one-sided, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit in the next sort of maybe 12 to 36 months with that as the context? So I'm giving you broad mandate to whatever you think is something that would come to your mind.
I think it's, sorry, I'm trying to think about this as I speak. I think there's a lot of opportunities that you've just highlighted in a lot of different venues and forums. And again, it's always impressive to me, and I'm not just saying this because I happen to be on a call with Canadians, but it's always impressive to me how Canada has managed to leverage its position in all sorts of different locations and fora in order to push an agenda forward. You know, they're one of the excellent sort of middle powers, like the Australians or the Singaporeans in that space. But Canada's in different conversations, which I think is great. And so you pointed to G7 as an example. I think that is a really useful forum, can be a really useful forum for highlighting especially what Canada does well. And I would say in the sustainability discussions, what's kind of nice about it is that you're not the Europeans. So you take a slightly different view than the Europeans do, and it might be more palatable to those, especially in Asia, who are not fond of being lectured about sustainability. So if you can have that sort of practical, which is what they like practical, pragmatic discussions about low carbon future, then you don't get into this sort of normative loaded arguments about sustainability in general. And I think that is, and you're not lecturing, which I think is crucial. So that kind of relationship I think is important. It's not that, I mean, we have different markets. Obviously Asia is a big place and it has lots of different concerns. Sustainability and low carbon future is not necessarily top of mind for all of Asia, but it will become increasingly important. So anything that you can do to highlight that I think is useful. And in the food security space, that though matters to a lot of other different countries. And so highlighting those sort of two areas around low carbon future and transition, et cetera, and what can you do to provide more consistency, stability around food, I think is useful. And I think Canada then has a new opportunity to put itself into those discussions in ways that are not really viewed as lecturing, hectoring, whatever, but just pragmatically solving problems. And I think that resonates well in most of Asia, at least.
I'd like to follow up on that just very briefly, Deb. One of the most important elements of our value proposition in markets like China, Japan, and Korea is the Canadian brand. particularly for ag commodities, food ingredients, and retail food. You know, the Canadian brand, as far as we understand, stands for quality, high quality, safety and security, competitive prices, and efficient delivery. Do you get a sense of the other markets in the ASEAN region? Do they see a Canadian brand, and can we take advantage of it outside of the major markets of China, Japan, and Korea?
Yes, but I think I would guess that there's a lot less familiarity with what it is. You know, just because, you know, the sales are relatively low in a lot of different markets. And we have some agricultural export powerhouses, particularly Australia, New Zealand, in similar, many, not always, but often similar kinds of areas. And so, you know, I think promoting the brand is useful. And you're obviously you're going to have to do this differently in different markets. I mean, one key thing about Asia is that we're not all the same. So 15 markets in RCEP alone, very different. If 16, if we include India in the Asia discussion, you know, wildly different markets with wildly different ideas about what needs to be done. But I think if you can provide all of them like practical, pragmatic solutions to their individual problems, and the more you can do that, the more you can tailor them, the better. And I think this food issue in particular, you can come at it from different ways, like how you want to phrase this for different markets. But once you hit the right tone and the right messaging, I think you should do well. I mean, because that's something that everyone is looking for. And they always have an underlying concern about food security, because we have a lot of people in Asia. So they always have an underlying concern about food security that has come and gone under the COVID period. But I think if you highlight, you know, the importance of secure, safe, consistent supply chains for food, that is something that everyone thinks is a great idea.
So if I may ask a question around that, Deborah. So again, about like we do have a lot of the trade that we do with Asia is mostly around commodities and ag and food. So just there's other kinds of companies that we work with, technology, different kinds of companies. What would be some of the biggest challenges for SMEs, Canadian SMEs, wanting to go into one of the Asian countries there? Do you have any kind of little pieces of advice or tricks of the trade that could be useful? Because we're already, you know, the ones that are trading there are mostly bigger and mostly in commodities.
It's a challenging place to do business for small businesses because the rules, the regulations are not the same, right? So I would say for your smaller businesses, if they start with TPP, CPTPP, and if they start with CPTPP member countries, that's easier because they're, first of all, the benefits are automatic, right? They get 0 tariffs, which is great for food, for anyone producing goods. The services access under CPTPP is phenomenal. So you can provide services, you can provide digital services, so you don't even have to leave Canada. So I think leveraging on the CPTPP benefits for small businesses is key. And then that gets you into markets that matter anyways, you know, Singapore, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, Japan, in ways that I think gets you that foothold. And then once you're in a market like a Singapore or Vietnam, then it's easier to find another market to go into, like a Malaysia, let's say, because you're more familiar with how the region works, what kinds of concerns matter to governments and to consumers. So I would say start with the CPTPP markets and figure out how, and I think this is where Canada West has done a nice job of illustrating some of the small business benefits from CPTPP. We've done a bunch of that too. We're doing it now for RCEP, sort of, you know, in very practical, sort of what do you need in order to export food? And in fact, we have 2 booklets that we did on TPP, on fresh and frozen food and processed food, to explain what are the benefits for food producers in particular in this agreement. And one of the things you have to do with these trade deals, and you have to do it for small businesses, you have to be very targeted. So you can't just sort of have a blanket, let's talk CPTPP, and have, you know, ranchers and tech people all in the same room, because it just, I mean, other than the sort of who's in it, after that, everybody's not interested in the same things. It has to be very targeted, has to be very sector specific. But I think there are real benefits to be had. And I would start with CPTPP export opportunities for goods and services investment. And then from there, they can go on to other markets in the region.
Hey, Deb, before I let Mustafa jump in, could you run through the candle case study?
Sure. So, you know, candles, let me get one. Here's one. Candles. We did candles because this is something that small businesses make, right? So small businesses make candles pretty often. And the challenge with making a candle and exporting it, well, there are many things, but one challenge is that the tariffs on candles are very high. So I don't know why, I guess because local small businesses, maybe they make them, I don't know, but the tariff on candles can be, you know, 20, 30, 40%. That's true for a lot of products that small businesses make, like candles, like personal care. I always keep using my lotion bottle, you know, hand soap, lotion, perfumes, shampoos, very high tariffs. So things that small businesses tend to make often have very high tariffs. But under CPTPP, everything falls to zero. So, you know, already you're more competitive than a lot of firms because, you know, you have a 30, 40% advantage, price advantage to start. So the tariffs fall. But you also have access to services, which is good. So then you can get retail sales and so forth, you know, logistics services, warehousing services, et cetera, to make the candle get to where it needs to go. But also crucial in the reason we liked candles particularly is the focusing on the intellectual property rights elements of the CPTPP. Because what is a candle? It's basically like, you know, wax in a bowl with a perfume. But if you can't get intellectual property protection for the scent and the branding, then anyone can just take your candle and make it, right? So this is really embedded in the candle for the small business is the IP protection and enforcement. So candles we thought was a nice example just because it shows why a chapter that otherwise doesn't seem like it's relevant to you is actually critical. Because if I can't protect the idea embedded in my candle, the design, the branding, the scent, I can't sell my candle. So CPTPP has all of those things. It has scent marks, it has trademarks, it has branding protection, and it has enforcement. So all of that is useful. Interestingly, I would note, I think RCEP also put in scent marks, so I'm very excited about that. So the point is that these are things that small businesses don't think about, but they matter a lot when you go into markets, and it helps you with avoiding infringement, you know, outright theft of your candle scent or whatever. And so that the agreement in TPP matters to small businesses because it's comprehensive. So it's tariffs, it's services, it's investments should you decide to invest, it's IP protection, it's like the whole range of things are dealt with for you as a small business. So even though it's a tough agreement in that it's huge, you know, it's you know, TPP is a massive, this TPP text, you know, is like, oh my gosh, no small business is going to know TPP. But actually, it's once you figure out what you need to do and where you need to do it, it's easier for small businesses because you don't have 50,000 SKUs in your inventory. You only have a few things that you need to worry about. Once you sort that out, then it's very easy for you to do CPTPP benefits.
So we're lucky because we don't need to know CPTPP because Carlo knows CPTPP. So we just ask Carlo and then he answers the questions for us, right?
I was looking for my copy of the agreement, which is actually around here someplace.
I wanted to ask a question on a couple different sectors. One is, you know, we're very fortunate here in the Edmonton metropolitan region that we have one of Canada's 3 hubs for artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that's an area I see as having tremendous growth, which is not necessarily tied to big companies. And so how can we offer that as something to be shared, to be leveraged by partners in Asia who may want to tap into that expertise? Because that's very much on the human capital sort of side.
Yeah.
And along with that, Deborah, is, you know, we touched on this earlier, because of Canada's unique situation of market access to all of North America and all of Europe, the potential for manufacturing of Asian companies here in our region for then re-export to the rest of North America or Europe, a second area. And we have the logistics infrastructure, right? So Prince Rupert is the closest port to Asia in North America, right? And it's basically got direct rail access from there into Edmonton, and from Edmonton straight down all the way into the Chicago and the Gulf Coast and straight across Canada to our brothers and sisters on across the prairie. So it's not something which is immediately obvious, I think, but it's something which could it be packaged into a conversation to, again, I'm always big on these joint ventures, these partnerships of things where both sides can benefit.
So I think you've got at least two issues there that are important and relevant. So I suspect that your average Asian's understanding of Canada is near zero. So, you have to explain how and why Canada as a destination makes sense. What is it? What is this access? Because, their sense of geography in Canada is worse than mine, which is not great in and of itself. So you have to explain that. And I think you just did a nice job doing so. And so that's the sort of narrative that you want to say. It's not just about coming into Canada for Canada. It's coming into Canada as a entry point for both North America, but also for Europe, because you have special access to Europe, which only parts of Asia have. And Europe is difficult to do business with. And wouldn't it be great if you were located in Canada and you could just use CETA and it would be awesome. So I think that is a story that you need to keep telling. And you need to tell your investors, because it's not just about Canada for Canada. It's also Canada as a bridgehead for lots of other things. That part of the story actually should resonate with a lot of Asian businesses and Asian investors, because they're used to doing that. They're used to sort of saying, I'm going to come into Singapore, but I'm not in Singapore for Singapore. Nobody's in Singapore for Singapore. They're all in Singapore for ASEAN. So that kind of, I come somewhere for the access it has somewhere else is common. So leveraging on that story, I think, is good. And explaining it in ways, again, more pragmatic, useful for businesses. So what do I get? It's not just Canada for Canada. On the first part of your question about tech, everybody's looking for tech help. So I think there should be a good story to be told around your tech help in general and the resources and so forth. One thing that will probably help you a bit is these digital agreements, because they sort of focus attention on who's in the digital space. So having Canada join DEPA is useful. Now, I will tell you up front that DEPA, frankly, is not an awesome digital agreement. It's designed to be a modular approach. The idea that Singapore had when they created this one was, let's make a bunch of modules, what they call modules, that have basic commitments, and then we build out from there. So the idea with DEPA was, if we could just get consistency across DEPA, that would be great. And then you could take the module and you could stick it in your FTA. So you don't even have to change it. It looks exactly the same. So you're building out consistency in different trade agreements. But in order to do that, the quality is a little bit lower, because you want to make sure that it appeals to the most number of people. But embedded in there are a lot of cooperative agreements, and cooperative agreements are starting to grow, particularly on big data and AI. So we have a number of digital-only agreements now that have cooperation commitments on AI and big data, which I think Canada should be part of that conversation. So what you want to do there is you want to say, let's have us in those conversations. Let's have our firms part of that dialogue, so that people go, oh, AI, let's call the Canadians, right? So you want to leverage on those collaborative, cooperative discussions around those modules to say, call us, like we have some expertise and we could give you some solutions to problems that you're facing. Because most of those, the existing commitments are still at the level of cooperation or MOUs. Let's discuss what we're going to do to regulate AI, for example, and then figure out what the trade rules should look like. So we have them in DEPA, we have them in Singapore has these digital economy agreements, DEAs, one with Australia, which definitely has an AI component in it, and one coming with South Korea and one coming with the UK. So there's more and more focus on these areas. And I think making sure that you get part of that conversation would be useful. So actually pushing your gut would be a good one. You could certainly have a Canada-Singapore DEA, digital economy agreement. Could be interesting, and it gets you at this, how do we get at the table in these conversations?
Carlo, back to you.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Mustafa. But I want to take full advantage of this chair next to you at this virtual wine bar and go from the general to a little bit more specific. And oh, by the way, the provincial government will be opening up new international offices in Tokyo, New Delhi, and in Singapore. So literally the chairs might be a little bit more closer to you in the very near future. We're looking forward to that. As we all know, the economy in China is recovering nicely. And it, in spite of COVID-19, and some would argue because of COVID-19, they're going to be GDP growth into the nearly 2% for 2020. And indeed, and because of that, and due to their strong export economy, China is paying huge premiums for shipping containers, making it far more profitable for shippers like Hapag-Lloyd to send them back empty than to refill them here in North America. The global competition for containers means that Thailand can't ship its rice, India can't offload its sugar, and Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta can't ship our lentils and peas in an efficient and cost competitive manner. Do you see an end to this logistics distortion? And do you see similar impacts in the ASEAN markets as well?
Yes, so the price of freight has gone through the roof, and the disruption in the logistics space and shipping space is global. It certainly matters here in Southeast Asia. It matters a lot to Australia, New Zealand, who are very reliant, of course, on sea freight. So yes, it's an issue. How do we solve this? I suspect, but I'm not certain about this one, that there will start to be pressure for governments to intervene and solve some of this, or at least come up with some emergency ruling or decree or something. I don't know what that would look like. I think at the moment, everyone is just hoping that market forces eventually sort themselves out. But I think this one is a real problem and it's a challenge. And I don't really know how you solve that. I can tell you that off the coast of Singapore at the moment, I have never seen so many ships anchored. Never. I mean, even in the 2008 crisis, when we had what I thought then was a crazy number of ships anchored, just sitting there waiting. Now it's much worse. Like the entire strait is bumper to bumper ships that are waiting for, I don't know what, to be delivered, to be profitable. I don't know what they're waiting for, but they're parked like crazy. So this disruption of shipping is a significant problem. And the disruption of air freight as a result of no passenger travel, also a challenge in the region. We only have, I think only 4 airlines in the region are making money, and that's the Koreans and the Taiwanese, because they can ship much of their lightweight, high value items, which are mostly electronics, semiconductors, et cetera, by air. And so they have converted a lot of their passenger carriers to doing pure cargo. And because their cargo is nice and conveniently lightweight and expensive, you can ship it by air. But everyone else who has heavy things, you can't load up an airplane and say, good luck with that one. So I don't know how long this disruption in supply chains and shipping will continue, but it is, the industry certainly is hopping up and down about this. And eventually governments will have to do something, but I don't think they can figure out what. And so I think we're just waiting to see if it sorts itself out at some point, but it is a challenge for everyone.
I would just add on that point, I know from my time in Dubai, a number of years, 13 years I was in Dubai, and Singapore 1.1 or 2.0, whatever you want to call it, Singapore was the godfather of Dubai, and the importance of shipping. The lead time for disruption in shipping is years, right? Because of how long it takes to build ships capacity. And in 2008, the number of shipping companies that went completely out of business because their rates were basically down to zero. So that's a challenge. But I know we've been speaking to DP World, Dubai Ports World. They have huge investments in Vancouver, Nanaimo, Prince Rupert, and they're constantly exploring ways to increase the capacity of terminals and containers through those ports. And they're talking about application of AI, automation, machine learning to increase the turnaround times of loading and unloading ships and so forth. So but that takes years to adopt, right, Chris? That's not going to help us in the short term. But in spite of all of that, there was also just an announcement yesterday out of Dubai. Our Canadian Consul General, in partnership with Isal Guerrer, who's one of the largest buyers of wheat and canola from Canada, last year was a record year. They bought $550 million worth of canola and wheat from Western Canada last year in 2020. And bulk of that is going to be re-exported to the region. So that same model of, I think, using each other as gateway markets, Deborah, is really, really something that we have not realized the potential of. And I think there's a lot to explore there.
And I
So
would say Dubai and Abu Dhabi both highly focused on this for supplying, and this is the challenge that they have, not just the Middle East, but potentially Europe. So you can use this as a gateway into Europe, which people haven't really thought about, but because of their speed and because of the investments that they've made in infrastructure, it can be an alternative venue in and out of Europe as well. So that's, you know, how they're positioning themselves. It's something that Singapore, of course, has done very well, positioning itself as a gateway to the rest of the region. And I think that is probably a pathway for the future. The challenge, of course, is that it looks lucrative, and so lots of people like to do the same thing. They say, "Oh, well, we're going to be the gateway to fill in the blank what." But it's not just like I need a berth for the ship. I need all of the associated infrastructure and services that can actually deliver on those promises. And that is the part that is often missing. It's sort of an ecosystem you need. Building that ecosystem takes time. And you need to be competitive at most of the levels of that ecosystem in order to really be competitive in the space, and not just like, let me just build a long dock and say, now we're ready for business, right? There's a whole lot that's attached to logistics infrastructure. But we're seeing more of it, which is good news. We're seeing more investment in logistics infrastructure across the region, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And I know you can complain about Belt and Road out of China, but there is a certain amount of investment by the Chinese, also then matched often by the Japanese, especially Koreans as well, into infrastructure investment in areas like building up ports in Indonesia, which is horribly, the ports in Indonesia are wretched. And so trying to build out more infrastructure investment to help with ports, crucially, but then also road and rail in places like Indonesia is important, because you're not going to be able to get your goods in and out of Indonesia very efficiently under its current structure.
And this brings up our third topic, which March 11th, which will be trade infrastructure. So, we've actually hit the time limit, and let's close out, Deb. I'll give you a lightning round. TPP growth, UK, Taiwan, what are the chances? And you've got 30 seconds, good or bad for Canada?
Any expansion of CPTPP is good, because it gives you more market access opportunities. You're already there, so you get new access without having to do very much work. It's fantastic. You want as many people as possible in, work hard on getting the Malaysians in, the Chileans, the Peruvians who are already in but haven't ratified, and get new members. Crucial for you.
And UK, Taiwan, chances?
UK high, Taiwan is ready, but you all have to make the political decision about whether you want to admit them. I would say yes, but that's because I'm not a politician. I would say, what are we waiting for? They're ready, they're on it, they're important, get them in. But I'm not a political leader.
All right. Well, we got that with the answer on India, but which we loved. This is the type of straight talk that we really need to hear from the region, the less guarded perspectives than we get.
I mean, India if you need job security, because you will be negotiating with the Indians for, the rest of your career. So then, absolutely. And it would be nice. I mean, frankly, it would be great if we could all get better agreements with India. That would be awesome. But it is a lifetime of negotiating to get to the outcome.
Well, it's job security for me to have someone else say that ahead of me. So I thank you for that. And with that, guys, we made it through the first one. Let's give a thank you again to Export Development Canada. It's been a great partner, the same sort of partnership we have with the World Trade Center Winnipeg as part of Trade Team Manitoba, the partnership we're forming with Edmonton Global as they get going, and the longstanding partnership we've had with our fellow rider fans out there in Saskatchewan. I would like to remind folks that our next talk will be March 4th. Yes, I can get away with being a rider fan. Our next talk will be March 4th. Everyone that's outside of Canada is, what the hell are they talking about? They've gone into Canuck speak. Our next talk is March 4th, and we'll focus on Brexit. The last time we used the word Brexit at the Canada West Foundation, we'll have Andy Barr from the British High Commission, who's been out west to talk to us in person, joining us virtually. We'll also put up links to Deb's work at the Asian Trade Center. Those case studies that they have for SMEs are incredibly practical. And we'll also be joined by Calgary Economic Development for our next talk. So again, thanks to EDC, thanks to Edmonton Global, thanks to the Saskatchewan Trade Export Partnership, thanks to the World Trade Center Winnipeg, and most of all, thank you to our colleague, longstanding colleague, many years, Deborah Elms at the Asian Trade Center. Thank you very much to everyone. Good night and have a good morning to those in Asia.
Thanks. Bye-bye.